Hi everyone, Alexander here, and welcome back to 30 Days of Symphony. Well, after a bracing little trip to the North Sea coast via Benjamin Britten and his 4 sea interludes from Peter Grimes, it's time to head back towards the Alps and enjoy another of the great symphonic geniuses of that Austro-German Central European tradition. Now it's time to savor the greatest of the symphonies of a composer totally worthy in the tradition of Beethoven, Schubert, and Brahms, the epitome of the Austrian late Romantic symphonic style, the symphonies of Anton Bruckner. You know, those of you who've gotten to know me over our years together in lacrosse, you know how much I love the French repertoire, the Spanish repertoire, the Scandinavian repertoire, and those great Russian romantics. But I have to admit, just as, we couldn't live without Italian cooking, just as we couldn't live without French wine, just as we couldn't live without that great British tradition of our English language, that gave us Shakespeare and the King James Bible, the British parliamentary tradition that gave us our democratic republic. It's that central line, those Austrian, German composers. I would actually say just Germany, Austria, and Italy, because without Italy we wouldn't have opera. That really is as that great Russian conductor whom I've referenced before, Serge Koussevitzky, said, the central line, and everything flowers away from that in either direction, whether you go towards the Ural Mountains and Russia or towards the Atlantic, the calm breezes of the English Channel and the fields of France. It's that Central European line of classical music that really is the core to understanding this repertoire that really is one of the great experiences of life. Bruckner is a most curious figure in 19th century music. If Johannes Brahms, just a few years his senior, was this great North German, severe, somewhat dry occasionally, professorial type, Bruckner is this, I don't want to say simpleton, because that's how he's often been seen. The French would have a word for this, an idiot savant, someone who on the surface is so simple, yet beneath the surface reaches the most profound of depths. When you think about this Central European, this Austro-German tradition, it's just been occurring to me that there are really 2 trains of thought, 2 lines within that central line. And this ultimately has nothing to do with geography, there is, if you will, kind of a northern line that starts out with Johann Sebastian Bach, his cantatas, his keyboard works, everything, the great genius, this lofty intellectual genius, I should say, most of all, goes from Bach to Joseph Haydn and to his monothematic symphonies and sonatas, the way Haydn, again, geographically a man of the South, don't misunderstand me, but the way Haydn will build an entire movement of a symphony from one little theme, one little idea. And then Beethoven, who rather inherits that tradition from Haydn, although of course Beethoven would never have admitted it, given his Hemingway-esque personality. But then that northern tradition, very austere, intellectual, goes on to Johannes Brahms. And then there is a southern line, if you will. It starts with J.S. Bach's alter ego, George Frederick Handel, who again, geographically a nice boy from Halle in northern Germany, but who then begins to make his career in Italy, then moves to England. It becomes literally known as the greatest German composer of Italian operas in England. But symbolizing this other strand of German music, this other strand of Germanic culture, if you will, that looks over the Alps and to Italy, to a kind of warmth and, in the best sense of the word, simplicity. Handel does that so brilliantly in all those operas and oratorios, and we all know the most famous of those oratorios, the Messiah. That tradition gets passed on to someone named Mozart, who, let us never forget, made his own orchestration of Handel's Messiah. And then that southern German simplicity and warmth, that gets passed on to Franz Schubert, who, again, you'll remember when Beethoven passes away in 1827, Schubert of the younger generation thinks, now is my chance to become the musical big man of Vienna. But poor Schubert, barely 30, he dies only a year later in 1828. If you want to know why I think Bruckner's 9 symphonies, actually they're more than 9, I think they're actually 11, because there are a couple he wrote before the official first symphony. Bruckner's symphonies are, and this is a vast simplification, but if poor Franz Schubert had been allowed to live a normal lifespan and had gone, if his life had gone into the later 19th century, the symphonies he might have written might have sounded like those of Anton Bruckner. Again, there is a warmth and simplicity in the greatest sense of that word. In Bruckner's symphonies, we do not, my friends, have the great North German professor Johannes Brahms with his constant sense of developing variation, the moment he introduces a 3 or 4 note melodic cell, he starts developing it. No. A Bruckner symphony is like a Mozart symphony or a Schubert symphony, where you have these blocks of material, these melodies, these subjects, as they used to say in music appreciation class, these thematic zones that go, there's one, and then there's another, and then there's another, and they're separate, and then they're developed in a development section, the middle section of a sonata allegro form, and then they are reprised in what we're all taught to know as the recapitulation. It's like a Mozart symphony or a Schubert symphony now taken to gargantuan lengths, because truly the first movement of a Bruckner symphony in and of itself can often be as long as an entire symphony by Mozart. Please don't jump to the conclusion that this means Bruckner's symphonies are, tired and, tiresome and long-winded. Quite the contrary. Bruckner is simply taking a Mozart symphony and, again, just increasing its dimensions like you would take a beautiful little house and turn it into a magnificent chateau. But again, the illusion versus Brahms, I think, is very important. Listening to a Brahms symphony is like going out to dinner with one of your best friends in the world, someone with whom you've had a long and complicated relationship, and you go out to dinner at one of your favorite restaurants, and the food and the wine and the conversation are superlative. And you have this deep conversation, you haven't seen them in a while, and you talk about the progress of your lives and your ups and your downs, and you have this great experience with that other person that's very intense. A Bruckner symphony, listening to a Bruckner symphony, is like walking into a vast temple, like walking into a great cathedral, and you are friends with not another person, you're friends with the universe, and you have to let that spirit just wash over you. So again, think of those building blocks of a great Mozart or Schubert symphony, where you get, 3 or 4 themes, melodies, and then they're developed, and then they're recapitulated. But again, to the ultimate degree, because with Bruckner, everything is an exercise in sonata form. Everything is an ABA form. When you get to the third movement of the symphony we're going to celebrate today, his fourth symphony. It's not like it's a scherzo and a trio and a scherzo. The scherzo itself is an ABA form. Then the trio is an ABA form. Then you go back, so there's an ABA form, and there's a mega ABA form. So you have to just put away, you know, the world of the iPhone. You have to put away your 21st century laser light attention span and just relax and recalibrate. And then you will begin, and I say begin because to enjoy a great symphony by Bruckner is a lifelong experience, but you will then begin to enjoy the genius of one of the symphonies of Bruckner. Bruckner, I've been mentioning Mozart and Schubert again and again. That's where the analogies stop. Bruckner, in his life story, was no Mozart. He was not only was he not a prodigy, he was the antithesis of a prodigy. He came from a family of village schoolmasters in the Austrian countryside. It was not until the age of 30, yes, you heard me right, not 13, 30, that he decided to become a full-time musician. And this is in the 1850s, all right? That was 30 was old in the 1850s. Now, again, remember, Mozart wrote his first symphony at 7. Bruckner doesn't write his first symphony until his early 40s. It's at 30 he decides to be a full-time musician. In his early 30s, he is appointed, because he is profoundly gifted, he is appointed the organist at the cathedral in Linz, which is one of the great second cities, along with Graz. It's the great second city of Austria. And then about 10 years later, in his early 40s, due to his astonishing brilliance as an organist, he is made the court organist for the court chapel for the imperial family in Vienna, the seat of the, again, then we're talking about the mid-19th century, the Habsburg Empire, that vast, sprawling, gloriously multicultural empire, whose glories I think only now we're beginning to fully understand. Bruckner is, on the one hand, at the top of his field, and yet he is still the village organist. He is known and derided, laughed at behind his back as this village simpleton. And then he starts writing these symphonies in middle age. And much like the great Belgian organist and composer César Franck, who eventually moved to Paris also in the mid-19th century, like César Franck, Bruckner, the country bumpkin, begins to develop, just not intentionally, but just because of who he is, begins to develop this cadre of followers, disciples, who come from the most sophisticated of cultural milieus. And Bruckner eventually gets this following, and then he writes more and more symphonies. Again, he wrote 9 symphonies, numbered symphonies, plus 2 kind of early student symphonies. And the first symphony with which he made a major reputation, not quite international yet, was his third symphony, which he had dedicated to Richard Wagner, of whom, again, this is the side of Bruckner that's kind of the simpleton. Bruckner became this kind of slavish devotee of Wagner, but not the, pan-Germanist, racialist philosophy, just the music. In fact, Bruckner had a piano short score of Wagner's greatest opera, Tristan und Isolde, but it was a score that had no words. It was a score of the opera without any words. He didn't care about the words. He just was slavishly devoted to the music. He then writes his first symphony that then does take on an international reputation. That's the symphony we're going to celebrate now. The Symphony No. 4 in E-flat, again, key signatures, my friends, the key of Beethoven's Eroica, E-flat being the most heroic key in the key signature in Western classical music, which he himself gives it the subtitle of the Romantic Symphony. Here, Bruckner is gonna, he's gonna play with the big boys. He's gonna write this vast, hour-long symphony, which again is this South German, Austrian symphony. in the style of Mozart or Schubert, but again, taken to vast proportions. It's like a beautiful hill, a beautiful, valley, and now you're at the Matterhorn. Again, listen for just giant blocks of sound, both in the themes, the way they take their time to spin out, and then you get to another beautiful theme, and then also blocks of sound, the way he orchestrates. In Bruckner's hand, he was one of the great church organists of his time, and in his hands, the symphony orchestra sounds like the mightiest cathedral organ in Europe. And this is a good thing, because again, it's a kind of sound quality, it's a magnificence of sound quality that matches the magnificence of his ideas. So once again, a 4-movement Viennese romantic symphony in the 4 movements of sonata allegro, slow movement, a scherzo with trio, and a very Austrian Ländler, a slow dance in 3/4 time, scherzo and trio, and then a magnificent Matterhorn of a finale. Again, you've got to leave, for the next hour, you've got to leave the 21st century. Take yourself back to a simpler, slower, quieter, steadier time. No telephones, no computers, just you and the space and the music. An utterly spiritual exercise. There is a beautiful little story about Bruckner and the first performance of this piece. Again, by the time he wrote the Romantic Symphony, Bruckner was finally catching on as the country bumpkin who, had a thing or two to say in the manner of writing a symphony in the generations after Beethoven. So the first performance of the Symphony No. 4 was given by no less than the Vienna Philharmonic under one of their greatest conductors, Hans Richter, who later made a great career in England and was a great influence on Sir Edward Elgar, but we'll get to Elgar later. Anyway, Hans Richter is one of the greatest conductors of his day, of any era, really. And he, imagine Bruckner, the little village church organist from the hinterland. Here he is in the Musikverein in Vienna, and the Vienna Philharmonic is playing his 4th symphony. After the performance, the first performance, Bruckner, in this moment of total, complete unsophistication, he gave the conductor a tip. He gave Hans Richter a tip. He took a thaler, a coin, an Austrian, what we would be like the equivalent of like a $5 bill. And he gave Hans Richter a tip. And he said, "Oh, my good man, you did such a great job with my symphony. Now go out to your favorite pub and drink a glass of your favorite beer to my health." And people go, "Oh, what a simpleton. Oh, can you imagine? He gave the conductor a tip." Hans Richter, the great Hans Richter, the greatest conductor of his time, Richter, who eventually took that thaler coin and had it attached to his gold watch chain, Richter went home that night and wept. Bruckner, Symphony No. 4.